welcome to American Catholic History. If you like our podcast, be sure to rate us and give us a review wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Today we're talking about the Knights of Columbus and their remarkable work during World War I. This is really a coming-of-age story for the Knights of Columbus. It was during this era that they really asserted themselves as the most significant lay Catholic organization in the United States, if not the world.
Right, and not only did they do amazing things that Catholics took note of, but some of the things they did during this period were later imitated by the government in big ways that everyone knows about, but most probably don't know that the Knights were doing those things first.
We'll talk about those things, but as you'll hear in this episode, there are many other stories about the Knights that we'll have more to say about in the future.
Absolutely. There's just so many stories that offshoot. It actually took some time to decide how to limit this episode to keep it, relatively short.
Right. Well, let's keep it short and get into it. The Knights of Columbus were, of course, founded in New Haven, Connecticut in 1882 by Father Michael McGivney, who was beatified in 2020.
Yes, he brought together men of his parish to form a society that would support fatherless families, combat anti-Catholicism, and would provide Catholic men a social organization that would prevent them from feeling the need to enter other fraternal organizations that the Church forbade membership in, like the Freemasons. And it didn't take long for this organization to spread across the country.
The Knights were also quick to establish from the get-go that they were not just a Catholic organization that only helped Catholics, but that they were a service organization and a patriotic organization.
Right, and this all came into play in 1916. A Mexican revolutionary called Pancho Villa was causing some problems along the border with the U.S. state of New Mexico. The U.S. Army had to send troops to push back, and they eventually invaded northern Mexico to try to capture Villa. Now, there's not a whole lot down there along that border, so there wasn't a whole lot to support the troops who were sent to the area.
But what towns that were there were Knights of Columbus councils. The Knights began to set up canteens or huts for the troops, places where the troops could find recreation, relaxation, counsel, cigarettes, stationery to write home, and other things. The Catholics among the troops could find sacraments there, and all of the services were free and available to all, regardless of creed. There were 15 of these canteens in all, and they were so successful and so well received that when the United States entered World War I in 1917, the Knights had every intention of continuing their service and expanding it.
The Supreme Knight at the time was James Flaherty, a Philadelphia lawyer and son of Irish immigrants. He was a truly transformational figure in the history of the Knights, and we'll most likely have an episode just on him at some point. With the support of the Supreme Council, Flaherty wrote to President Woodrow Wilson expressing the Knights' desire to help. He wrote, in part, "The crisis confronting the nation hereby reaffirms the patriotic devotion of 400,000 members of this order in this country to the Republic and its laws, and pledges their unconditional support to the President and Congress."
This pledge of support included establishing these K of C huts near all training bases, and even to bring them overseas and establish them behind the lines where soldiers would have access to them while in theater. Flaherty made clear to the president that the services would be provided to all in uniform, regardless of creed, and none would ever be charged for anything.
This arrangement was made clear in the motto that the Knights used for the huts: "Everyone welcome, everything free." And they meant that. To fund this massive undertaking, the Knights launched a fundraising campaign seeking to raise $1 million, which is just shy of $29 million in today's money. So we're not talking chump change here.
No. I mean, I'd just be happy with $1 million.
I'd be happy with
The
$500,000.
fundraising goal was ambitious, but the response was overwhelming. They ended up raising, you ready for it?
I am.
$14 million.
That is just astounding.
Yes. And I'm not done. In addition to that $14 million, they were granted another $30 million. So the total in today's dollars was about $1.3 billion. That's billion with a B. Just
Yeah.
Staggering.
It's hard to wrap my mind around that. $1.3 billion raised in this still kind of young organization. I mean, that kind of cash would really make the huts a doable thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And they were able to set up huts all across the country, near or on most every military base.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And then shortly after the troops started shipping overseas in June of 1917, the Knights went too. Huts were built on both the eastern and western fronts. At their peak in 1918, there were about 150 huts worldwide. Wherever U.S. troops were stationed, you'd find a KFC hut, even including one in occupied Germany.
And what the Knights provided in the huts was all about giving the troops a place to relax and find respite. Everyone could take advantage of the home away from home atmosphere. But for the Catholics, including the roughly 100,000 Knights of Columbus, there also was a chaplain who could hear confessions and offer Mass.
The huts were staffed by secretaries, who frequently were men who hadn't qualified for military service due to some disability, but who wanted to do what they could to help. But not all of the secretaries were men rejected for military service.
Yes, there were some women in the ranks, and one of the more well-known people to go over to Europe as a secretary was Johnny Evers, who played second base for the World Series winning Boston Braves in 1914. He was NL MVP that year, and he previously had been part of the famous Tinkers to Evers to Chance double play trio with the Chicago Cubs. I just can't say that without thinking of
I know, yeah.
Frank Sinatra and Gene Kelly.
Right.
Anyways, but Evers was a knight, and he wanted to do his part.
Yeah. And these secretaries would dress in uniform that looked similar to the soldiers' own uniforms, but the secretaries had badges with the letters KC for Knights of Columbus on their shoulders. This gave rise to the secretaries being called Casey's. The Casey's handed out loads of little items like some things we listed before: candy, gum, cigarettes, playing cards, sewing kits, razors, sporting equipment like baseballs and gloves, as well as rosaries and prayer books made especially for soldiers. They also could be found going out to the front lines among the trenches to hand out items to the boys who couldn't get back to the hut.
To put into perspective the sheer amount of stuff the Knights provided, let's look at just one of the things they handed out: stationery. Over the course of the war, the KFC huts gave away 1,800 tons of stationery to soldiers so they could write home. And that's a lot, because it takes about 100 sheets of paper to make just 1 pound. And we're talking 3,600,000 pounds of paper. So if you move the decimal point 2 spots to the right, that means that the Knights gave away about 360 million sheets of paper for letters home.
That's a lot of letters coming back from over there, over there.
Now we've moved from Sinatra
Yeah.
and Kelly to George M. Cohan.
George M. Cohan.
Yes. But mentioning the war song Over There reminds me that the KFC huts actually had their own theme song based on their motto. Everybody welcome, everything free. That's the slogan of the KFC. For all the boys here and over there, the KFC is doing its share.
Man, we're turning into a little song and dance troupe here.
I don't actually know the tune for that.
I tried to look it up. I couldn't find it. I'm sure. Yeah, I saw the sheet music, but I couldn't find the video.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But the Casey's in their huts weren't just about giving away free items. They were also about events and entertainment. At the huts, troops could catch a movie, sing ringside. They could sing ringside. Or at a microphone. Take your pick. They could sit ringside at boxing matches, catch a vaudeville performance, find a book in the library, take part in athletic tournaments like baseball, and hear a band or other performer.
That's where they get to sing ringside.
Yes.
So, if this sounds to you a lot like what the USO is known for from World War II and Vietnam,
yeah,
you'd be right.
Yep. The military caught on that this sort of thing is a really good idea, so they, made it more institutional.
So, as the song says, the Knights certainly did do their share through the huts. The huts, however, weren't the only way that knights served in the Great War.
Right. We already said that 100,000 of the 2.8 million soldiers who went to Europe were Knights of Columbus. For an order that was only 36 years old, that's a remarkable number. About 3.5% of all troops were knights.
And among those 100,000, there were some who were very notable. The first to mention is the very first U.S. service member to die in the war, Lieutenant William Fitzsimmons. Fitzsimmons was a doctor from Kansas City. He was among the first 5 doctors to ship overseas, and he was killed on September 4th, 1917, when the hospital in Pas-de-Calais, where he was working, was hit by a German bomb.
Of his death, former President Teddy Roosevelt said, "To the mother he leaves, the personal grief must in some degree be relieved by the pride in the fine and gallant life which has been crowned by the great sacrifice. We, his fellow countrymen, share this pride and sympathize with this sorrow."
Another notable casualty was the poet Joyce Kilmer, a convert to the faith, member of the Knights of Columbus, and a fearless intelligence officer who was felled by a sniper's bullet on July 30th, 1918. We talked about him and read some of his poetry in another episode that we did.
Yes. And then the final knight to die was actually the final U.S. officer killed in the war. First Lieutenant Father William Davitt. Davitt was a priest from your neck of the woods, Worcester, Massachusetts. He had volunteered to serve as a chaplain with the infantry. He had earned the Croix de Guerre and the Distinguished Service Cross for leading the effort to rescue 40 wounded men who had been cut off.
His death was so tragic because of the timing. On November 11th, 1918, the day the armistice was to take effect, Father Davitt was at his regimental headquarters near the Argonne Forest. About 9:45 a.m., he climbed a tree and hung a U.S. flag in its branches. He clambered down, saluted, and began to celebrate the end of the war. One final German artillery shell came whistling over the line and struck just feet from where he stood. Father Davitt was killed instantly, less than 75 minutes before the war was officially over.
It's just so senseless.
Yes, absolutely.
Of the 116,516 American casualties of World War I, 1,500 were knights. From the way they served in the trenches, plus the respite so many soldiers found in the huts, Knights of Columbus gained much respect and admiration from their work during the war, and their numbers swelled by 400,000 new members between 1917 and 1923.
One admirer was General John Pershing, Supreme Commander of the American Expeditionary Force. He said of the Knights of Columbus, "Of all the organizations that took part in the winning of the war, with the exception of the military itself, there was none so efficiently and ably administered as the Knights of Columbus."
But the Knights weren't done being awesome. When the war was over and all those boys came home, the Knights used money from that massive fundraising haul before the war to establish an education fund to help soldiers pay for furthering their education. Again, the government kind of took a cue from their work and established the GI Bill in 1944.
In the aftermath of the war, the Knights also raised money to donate a statue of the Marquis de Lafayette to the heavily Catholic town of Metz in Alsace-Lorraine. Alsace-Lorraine had been occupied by the anti-Catholic Germans for 40 years, so they were very much appreciative of the coming of the Americans.
More than 200 knights made the trip to France for the dedication, and at the ceremony, Supreme Knight Flaherty echoed what General Pershing had said when the American forces had first arrived in 1917. Flaherty said, "Lafayette, we are still here." The statue of Lafayette, unfortunately, only stood for 20 years. It was destroyed when the Germans reoccupied Alsace-Lorraine at the outset of the Second World War. There is much more that can be said about this trip, and we will likely have an episode in the future about the Knights' visit to Europe, because not only did they go to France and Alsace-Lorraine, they also made it down to Rome and had an audience with the Pope. Rather incredible trip. But we'll leave that narrative there for now.
In 2017, to commemorate the centennial of America's entry into the First World War, the Knights of Columbus opened an exhibit at their museum in New Haven, Connecticut. The display included uniforms, examples of items given away at the huts, stories, and other artifacts to tell the tale of how the Knights of Columbus made a difference during the war to end all wars. This has been American Catholic History. If you enjoy American Catholic history, please become a supporter. We've got great perks for supporters and merch too.
Oh, yeah.
Get information on how to become a supporter and the perks at americanCatholicHistory.org/support.
Also on our website, look for that merch. Sign up for our newsletter, learn more about the Knights of Columbus and the Great War, see about our pilgrimages, and find other great stories from American Catholic history.
We also love the great reviews our listeners leave. Those and the 5-star ratings help others to find us. You can email us feedback, questions, tips for episode topics, and other comments at feedback@americanCatholicHistory.org. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/AmericanCatholicHistory, on Instagram at ACH_podcast, and follow us on Twitter at ACH1513. I'm Noelle Heaster-Crow.
And I'm Tom Crow.
Thank you once again for joining us on American Catholic History, made possible by listeners like you.